Good evening, everyone. Hello from Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm Angela Garbacz, and tonight we're going to be baking from my book, Perfectly Golden. I believe in the chat, our friend Candace, who's helping kind of run this, is going to put in all the information about where you can buy this from the book festival, and all that good information. I'm so excited that you have chosen to spend some time with me tonight. Welcome to my home. Anymore in this new world we're living in, 5:30 feels kind of late. Am I right? I mean, so I am not at one of my bakeries. I am in the comfort of my own little home. So we are going to be baking some crumble buns from Perfectly Golden. It's one of my favorite recipes from the book, and it's one of the most popular recipes that we make at my stores, Goldenrod Pastries. So I'll give you a little glimpse at what we're making. So this is something that I believe we came up with at Goldenrod, and we're going to be using our vegan bun dough. All of my recipes in the cookbook in Perfectly Golden are really adaptable. So depending on how you choose to eat or how you need to eat based on restrictions or preferences, you can find recipes, dairy-free, vegan, gluten-free, combination of any of those. So we're going to be using our vegan bun dough, which is my personal favorite. It's super fluffy, really, really delicious, not too sweet. And then we're going to fill it with apple preserves, which is perfect for this time of year. And mine actually are made with some local Nebraska City apples, which is not very far from here. All right, so we're going to dive right in. I'm very passionate about bun dough and the technique, so I'm sure we'll talk more about bun dough and yeast and everything involved with it than you ever thought you cared to know. But please, as questions come up, please put them in the chat room. I'll be checking those every so often, and I can usually see when they pop up. If I've got my eyes in the dough, I might miss them, but rest assured I will check back. All right. Not sure how I got muted there. All right, we're gonna get started. I believe this recipe will be sent out to all of you tomorrow, as well as any FAQ that come up during the class. I really love running a class this way so that you get the recipe and the questions answered the next day, so that while we're here together, you can just focus and be able to ask any questions as they come up and enjoy your time with me, I hope. All right, so we are starting how all good yeasted doughs start. We're starting with yeast and sugar. I'm not going to be giving you the amounts today, since you are going to be getting that recipe tomorrow. So if you have questions about amounts, quantities, those are all going to be answered for you tomorrow. I use active dry yeast. It's my favorite, and sugar. So we are going to be adding almond milk to this. I go into a lot of detail in the book about alternative milks. I use almond milk at the bakery. I love the fat content of it. It really mimics a dairy milk really, really well. And it's what I like. If you can have whole milk, go ahead and use that. The only non-dairy milk that I would stay away from for this kind of thing is like a canned coconut milk with all that extra fat, or like a rice milk, because it's a little bit not quite fatty enough. So we are going to dump that in to our sugar and our yeast. And so this milk is nice and warm. I heated it up for a few minutes in the microwave. I'm gonna whisk these together so they get nice and combined. And then we're gonna let this bloom for a second. So what I mean by bloom, like I was saying, the milk was heated up in the microwave. You can do it on the stovetop if you'd like as well. But we want the milk to be nice and warm. So we are activating the yeast, we're blooming it. And so yeast is activated, we're bringing it back to life with heat from the warm milk, and with sugar. It feeds on sugar. It needs that sugar to get going and start activating. So if you're using a recipe that you don't want to be sweet, you can just use like a little bit of sugar just for that yeast to start kind of activating and becoming alive. We're gonna let this sit for a little bit, a couple of minutes until I can show you what it looks like when it's nice and bloomed. A lot of times I get asked, why didn't my bun recipe work? Is it my yeast? Is my yeast dead? Is that bad? So because I'm a baker, I'm a pastry chef, my yeast, I fly through it pretty fast. But the only time your yeast is really gonna die, is really gonna like stop working for you, is if you've kept it in a warm environment or in your cupboard above the oven for, you know, let's say like 5+ years. I always like to keep my yeast in the freezer, even at the bakery when we're flying through it really quickly, because it just keeps it fresh. But chances are your yeast is not dead. Chances are maybe your milk wasn't warm enough when you got started, you didn't give it long enough to bloom and activate, your dough didn't stay warm enough. It's usually that is why your yeast isn't working, your dough isn't rising, as opposed to your yeast just being dead. So chances are your yeast is fine. You just want to make sure that it is activated with both the heat of a liquid, whether that's milk or water, or and the sugar, and that will really help. And so what kind of happens during this blooming process is the yeast is becoming alive again, and you can start to see like a lot of bubbles are forming, and there's kind of like a mass that forms at the top. I was doing a class similar to this last week. We were talking about dough. Like I said, I'm very passionate about bun dough. And I realized that it's kind of like a weird analogy, but bear with me. If you're looking at a pond and there's like a mass of algae or moss on the top and it moves as a unit across the top of the pond, that's kind of what you're looking for with your yeast. You're looking for it to bloom, and I'll show you this a little bit closer to the camera so you can see it, but you're looking for the yeast to sort of form a foam at the top, and it'll have some mass to it, and when you move the bowl, it'll move as one. So we're gonna wait just a couple of seconds longer for you to be able to see this. One thing I also like to really remind people is don't add salt at this step. Salt will actually kill your yeast. So wait until the next step when you have a lot more ingredients added, and then you can add your salt. Dough really isn't that hard. There's just a few little basic rules. All right, we just had a question. It looks like, so Candace, if you're on, if you can make me a host, that's the only way that I'm gonna be able to see the questions. So if you can make me a host, that would be great so I can answer them. Okay, I saw your question. I promise we'll get to it. So you can kind of see here, it's a little bit hard to show, but you can see that there's a mass at the top there, and the yeast is looking really nice and foamy. All right, let's answer that question. Okay, unfortunately, I cannot see that question. So I promise we'll get back to it, but our magicians on the other side will get that fixed. All right, our yeast is bloomed. It smells really good. You can see it's really frothy on top. Okay, let's see. Candace sent me the message. I know you're making this vegan, but is it okay to use dairy in your recipe? Absolutely. And all of those swaps are going to be in the recipe that I send you tomorrow. Like I said, you can use dairy milk if that's what you prefer. For my next step, this is not a beautiful white wine as it looks like. This is vegetable oil. So that's going in. I really love using vegetable oil for bun doughs because it is really easy to work with. It doesn't have a lot of flavor. It's great fat, and and by not have a lot of flavor, it's like you're not using olive oil, you're not using coconut oil, which coconut oil, once it sets up, is so firm when it gets a little cool that makes it a little challenging to work with the dough. So vegetable oil, I really love, even if you are using dairy in the recipe. I personally still prefer vegetable oil, but you can use melted butter. All right, and we're gonna add the flour. So the recipe calls for, in this case, I'll tell you because it's helpful information, it calls for 5 cups of all-purpose flour. And there are swaps for gluten-free in the recipe, in the book. I'm not gonna get into that tonight because it's kind of a bigger conversation, but there's a huge portion of the book that's dedicated specifically to gluten-free flours. I make it really, really easy for you to make these recipes gluten-free. but tonight we're just doing vegan. So it calls for 5 cups of flour. And I always say when you're making a dough recipe, don't add all of the cups of flour to begin with, because although the recipes are tested, I do this with any recipe I follow, any recipe I make myself. Even though they're tested, the climate's always a little bit different. The dough is always going to be a little bit different. I always like to err on the side of caution and not use all of the flour up front and then have to kind of counter it with more liquid. So always reserve about a cup or so back. You can always add it. It's harder to take it away. So I'm going to start with 4 cups. All-purpose flour. I'm going to add my salt as well. This is Diamond Crystal kosher salt. You can use any salt that you're really happy with. All right, so I have my finished buns baking and I cannot forget them. I would hate to forget them. All right, so I'm gonna use a wooden spoon and my hands to make this dough because I love to just embarrass myself and get winded in front of you because it is hard work. No, but actually, I really think it's important to make baking really accessible for people. And so I like to show how you can do it without equipment like a stand mixer. Plus, I have given all of my stand mixers to my stores. So I don't have one at home. And it's also really great to know how to make it without. If you can make something without, equipment, you can make it with. All right, so I'm just using a wooden spoon to start mixing this together and get it started. And then I'll show you my favorite kneading technique as well. I know that vegan, gluten-free kind of gets a bad reputation. I really think it's important to remind people that it's not, shouldn't have a bad reputation. We use a lot of fat, we use a lot of sugar. That's what makes pastries really, really good. Oftentimes people go to vegan or gluten-free, dairy-free, whatever, because they want it to be a healthier option. And for me, I don't personally eat dairy because of health reasons and how it makes me feel. But I still think that it's important to have treats and to treat yourself. So we don't skimp on the sugar. That makes treats really, really moist. It makes treats really delicious. And we don't skip on the fat because that makes treats very tender. It makes buns very fluffy. And that stuff's really important. So I always tell people, we're not doing this because we want to have a healthy product. We're doing it because that's how people choose to eat or have to eat. So that is just that. Okay, so it looks like I can add my last cup of flour. Sorry about that. And we'll just add that in and then I'll start kneading it a little bit. I'm starting to think, what am I going to do with all of these buns in my home tonight? I wish I could be in person with all of you and share it, but instead I think I'm going to have to just ring the doorbell at all of my neighbors and drop off a few buns, which I think is a really great habit to get into these days, especially. I always think it's a great habit to give treats to your neighbors, but especially, you know, if you have neighbors who seem like they haven't left the house in a while, drop off some treats for them. It'll make their day. All right. This is a bendable bench scraper. I really love these. They're very inexpensive at restaurant supply stores. Webstaurant.com is one that I always direct my class participants to. I think these are like under $1. It's great for just scraping out the bowl. I'm gonna sprinkle some additional flour on my work surface and dump this all out. The other tool that you're going to see me using a lot is this metal bench scraper. Again, a very inexpensive thing to get for your kitchen. I talk about all of the supplies that I think are really helpful at the beginning of Perfectly Golden, my book. And they're all very inexpensive and really accessible, easy to find. And you can do a lot of things with this. You can cut your buns, you can scrape your surfaces, you can cut bars with it. It's a really, really, really good thing to have in your kitchen. All right, add a little more flour. I still haven't added all 5 cups of my flour. I added probably 4 3/4 cup of flour. So then as I'm kneading in more flour, it kind of accounts for that. So how I learn to knead and how I do it, so I kind of gather this all up, and then I fold it over, and then I take the back of my hand or the palm of my hand or the heel of my hand, fold it over and press. And then I turn it a 1/4 turn, fold it over and press. And then as you can see, I'm kind of swirling it around to make sure that the dough doesn't stick. And then I just keep doing that. I tell this story in my book, and I always think it's a good one to tell people too. If you don't love this kind of kneading, I'm gonna get rid of some of the extra flour. We don't want too much. I always tell people, if this kind of kneading doesn't work for you, that's fine. I think it's really great, really important to find techniques that work for you. My grandmother, my dad's mom, was a very short woman. She came up to about here on me. She had really bad arthritis in her hands and her arms. And so this was really a challenging way for her to knead. And I learned to bake from her, learned to make dinner rolls, her coffee cake, which uses this recipe as well. It's in the book. And she didn't have enough leverage with her little body and her arthritis to knead this way. So she would put all the dough in the bowl and she would just punch it down, and then she would fold it over and punch it down. So I'm going to keep doing this for a little bit, but the whole point of kneading is to activate the gluten, the protein in the dough. And so that is activated with physical manipulation as well as heat. In this case, we're using physical manipulation to create strands of gluten, which will create structure in the dough. So if you're making this recipe gluten-free, I'm not going to get into the flour, as I told you. It's a bigger conversation, and there's a ton in the book about it. If you are making this gluten-free, you won't do this. You won't need it because you're not developing gluten. There's no gluten to develop, so it just gets mixed together and you use it straight away. That's really the only difference between the 2 bun doughs. So I'm just going to knead it, keep talking until I can show you how it looks nice and smooth. Now would be a great time to pop in with any questions if you have them, any of your favorite buns that you like to make. The bun chapter is the first chapter in the book and one that I was really passionate about. So I include like our cinnamon roll recipe, which is one of the most popular things that we make at Golden Round Pastries. We have a crumble bun recipe, some really great cocoa buns that I love, and they get covered in a dark chocolate ganache, which is incredible. We do morning buns, coffee cake, sticky pecan rolls. As you can tell, I love this chapter. All right. So you can see the dough is really, really smooth. It's very supple, it's very soft, it's really nice. So we want this to rest for a little bit. I can't use this right now. The gluten is really like tensed up right now, so we can't roll it out. It also needs to rise. So I would let this sit aside in a warm place for about 30 minutes. I usually preheat my oven right now, so then I can put it in a bowl, put it on top of the oven, and that's a great warm place. Another tip that my grandma had was to fill the sink with a little bit of warm water, cover your bowl with a towel, and put that bowl in the warm water, making sure that it's not so high that you get water in your bowl. So lucky for us, I do have some dough ready to use. I will not make you wait 30 minutes. All right, so here is my dough. This dough I picked up from the bakery, and one thing that I really like to do there, it's a great make ahead step for people at home too, is we made this dough yesterday. Let's see, did we get a question? Let me double check. What kinds of buns are we making? Welcome to the class. We're making apple crumble buns. These happen to be a vegan dough with vegan crumble for my book, Perfectly Golden. Welcome. So this dough was made yesterday. I always like to give people tips on making their products ahead in case you only have a little bit of time every day. So you can make the dough, the step that we just finished before rising, wrap that up in plastic wrap, stick it in your refrigerator. You can let that sit in there, honestly, for 5 or 6 days before you use it. Bring it out about an hour before you want to use it so it can come up to room temperature, and then it's ready for you to use. You can also roll out your buns the night before you want to have them, hours before you want to have them, pop them in the fridge. And then I always recommend to people, when you turn on your oven, just stick the cold buns in the oven, and so they start to rise and come to temperature as your oven is preheating. All right. So this dough is very different than what we just used. It's very relaxed. It's very soft. It's been sitting out at room temperature for about an hour. And it's the same quantity of dough that you just saw, but it has just expanded and risen and become a little softer. We had another question come in. Maybe not. Okay. So I'm going to flour my surface really nice with a little bit more all-purpose flour. Whenever I do this, I'm making sure that my dough isn't going to stick to the counter. You've done all this work to make this wonderful dough, and the last thing you want is for it to stick to the counter. So double check it often. A little more flour on top. I am using a French rolling pin. It's my favorite kind of rolling pin. It does have tapered ends. I really, really like this style. Some of my bakers prefer to use a rolling pin that has like the handles. That's what I grew up using. But this is my preferred kind of rolling pin. All right, we're rolling this into a rectangle. So we want to start it with a rectangle. I always like, so instead of standing right here and twisting my arm this way, I always like to move, and it makes more sense for my ergonomics to press in the direction that I'm standing. So we want this to be about 20 inches by 10 inches. Make sure it's not sticking. And then I keep kind of like pulling my edges to make sure that we have a nice rectangle. Awesome. And so the dough is about 1/4 of an inch thick, maybe 1/3 of an inch thick. And that's a really nice thickness. This dough just feels so great. I could just keep like rolling it out and messing with it, but I will stop. I'm gonna check my other batch. You can see those later. That's the reward when we're done. All right, so if you've made any kind of like cinnamon roll or morning bun like this before, you know that the next step is to spread some kind of fat, butter, shortening, whatever you want to use, and then sugar. So because these are vegan, because I'm dairy free, I really like to use vegetable shortening. I think it is the best dairy free option. As opposed to like using a vegan butter, it's not my favorite thing. I don't love a vegan butter. I feel like it imparts kind of some plastic flavors sometimes, or just artificial flavors. And so I like vegetable shortening. It's what we use at the store. It is really great fat without adding a lot of weird flavor. If you want to use softened butter, you totally can. I'm just using vegetable shortening. I do believe there's a difference. I use Crisco all of the time. I think it's way better than generic brands, but use what you have and what you like. So you can see I'm just spreading all the way to the edges, to the corners, a really, really thin layer. Making sure you get it all the way to the edges. And the great thing about vegetable shortening is it's always at a great consistency at room temperature. But just make sure that your butter, if you're using it, is really not chilled. Otherwise, it's going to pull and rip your dough, and you don't want that. So the next step is adding sugar. So if I were making, let's say, a cinnamon roll or a pecan sticky roll, I would use brown sugar at this step. But because we're doing a crumble bun, I really like to use granulated sugar. Looks like we have a question. I do not see a new question, unfortunately. So the sugar, we're just going to make sure is in a nice, thin, even layer. Again, use the quantity in the recipe to spread that all the way across. There was a question, go ahead and send that again. I just couldn't see it there, so I don't want to miss it. Spread your sugar around in a nice even layer. Oh, do I use butter flavored Crisco? No, I do not. I just use regular. Butter flavored Crisco sometimes has soy protein, which a lot of my customers have allergies to, or it will actually have dairy in it. Same with like Pam spray, nonstick spray, butter flavor, sometimes it will have dairy in it. And so I just use like the original for all of those. So I have a really nice thin layer of sugar, and then we're gonna roll it into the roll before we cut it. So this is always really fun. I just take the tips of my fingers and flick up the bottom of this to fold it over for our first little roll. I like to make kind of a tight spiral. If you like it to be a little fatter, you don't have to roll it quite as tight as I am. And then you pull it back and fold it over to keep just swirling. All the way across. I'm not sure where everybody is tuning in from tonight. Here in Lincoln, it looks like the weather is changing and we might be getting a little bit of a storm tonight. It's gonna get cold tomorrow. Perfect baking weather, perfect bakery weather. We look forward to it all year. So I have my nice log, my nice swirled log of dough here. I'm gonna make 8 buns from this. You can do 12 if you'd like. If you have more people coming and you wanna use one recipe, make them mini buns. At one of my stores at the coffee shop concept, we do miniature buns, whereas the bakery, we do big buns. So cut these into a size that you really love. A tip that I always like to show people is I'm gonna do 8. So I'm gonna cut this in half. I'm using my bench scraper. Like I told you, you can just do everything with this. If I were ever to be a spokesperson for something, it would be for metal bench scrapers. I love them. Cut each half in half again, and cut each half in half again. All right. Move these out of the way a little bit so I can transfer them to my pan. This is just a standard jelly roll pan. I believe it's 13 by 18 inches, rimmed jelly roll pan. This fits standard ovens at home. It's a great size. I always use parchment paper when I'm baking. This is unbleached parchment paper. You can buy it in a roll at the store. If you don't want to buy parchment paper, if you don't have parchment paper, just grease this with some Pam or butter or shortening, whatever you're using, and that'll be fine. You just don't want your buns to stick. So we have this end of the swirl. And here's the thing, if we just plop these down on the pan and we don't handle the tail, as I like to call it, when they bake, that tail is going to separate from the rest of the swirl and it's going to kind of get wild on the pan. So what I really like to do is take that tail and tuck it underneath. I'll show you that again. Grab the tail from the end of the swirl, tuck it underneath, and then I kind of just press this a little bit. So I love this tail because the ends then don't fling off and it keeps the pan very neat this way. But I also really like it because it is the most delicious part of any bun. It is my personal favorite part. I'm also like an outside edge kind of person. I like the texture and the flavor that comes from the outside. And when you have this tail, it bakes to a nice golden brown on the bottom. You can kind of peel that piece off first, save it for the end if you're that kind of person. I'm not into delaying things, so I always eat that part first. All right. And I'll just show you really quick how soft this dough is at this point. Like it's very, very soft. Very fluffy. It's starting to rise a little bit because it's been out for so long and my oven's been on, so my kitchen's a little warm. So I'm gonna set this on top of the oven to let it rise a little bit while we make the crumble and then we talk about the preserves. I'll tidy up my mess a little bit. Again, I'm gonna use the bench scraper. I think you are getting some info in the chat about where to buy books, how to support the festival, how to support the authors who are involved. We do appreciate that. It's always great to support small businesses, smaller businesses, and organizations like the book festival and the libraries, if you can. That's my soapbox. All right, so because this is, let's see. You have a question or was that just the announcement? Okay. I know that some recipes call for buns to be placed in muffin tins or a rectangular baking pan. What are the advantages to using a baking sheet as opposed to these other methods? So that's a really good question. You can put them in a muffin tin. It's mostly just preference and how you like them to look. So if you were to put them in a muffin tin, I've done that before. It just keeps them very, very tight and they kind of grow out. The swirl will kind of come out the top. I think it's really beautiful, but it's a very specific texture because it has so much more contact with the metal that you get a lot more browning, which I personally really, really love, but there's not as much of like a fluffy center. And so personally for my customers, I know that they prefer like that soft kind of fluffy situation. I know that it's just kind of a stylistic thing. So you could do any of these recipes that are in my book. If you put them in a muffin tin, it will change your baking time. Probably they haven't been tested in that, but there's no reason if you really like the way that those look, which I do too, it like starts to swirl at the top. There's no reason that you can't bake any recipe in those pans. It's just going to affect your baking time. So you need to kind of understand your oven and how baking times and temperatures work because it's not gonna be a direct swap. So if your oven runs hot, I would say it's gonna take maybe a little bit, I don't know, I haven't tested that. It might take the same amount of time because although they're taller, they're narrower probably in most cases. So you're still, it might kind of even out as opposed to be fatter and flatter. So you can play around with it, play around with your oven temperature. If it looks like they're getting brown really quickly, just turn your oven down. If it looks like it's taking forever, crank your oven up. I hope that's helpful. All right, so we are gonna make the crumble for the crumble buns. Like a lot of the recipes in the book, I tried to give people recipes that are gonna be really versatile. So you're not just making a recipe that can only be used for one thing. It's something that you can use for a lot of different things. So this crumble is one that is based on something that my mom and my grandma would make, and we would put it on like my grandma's peach coffee cake, which is in the book. We would put it on muffins, we would put it on coffee, like traditional style coffee cake. And it's just a really, really great recipe to have. There's somebody who has been baking a lot from the book and posting on social media, which is super fun to see. And she, at the beginning of quarantine time period, she had never baked before. And then she got the book and she started baking. And, you know, she started with cinnamon rolls, and then she dabbled it with some other recipes. And what's been very cool to see, and what I hope a lot of people will be able to do with the book, is to take a lot of different recipes and create your own desserts. So she took the pie crust recipe, made it into a galette, like a crostata, a pie panless pie, a freeform pie, filled it with, I think, one of our preserves, and then put this crumble on top. So you can really take the recipes and do with them what you would like. So it's very simple. It's if you're looking at ratios, it is 2 parts flour to 1 part sugar. So like if you're doing 2 cups of flour, you'll use 1 cup of sugar. My flour goes in, my granulated sugar goes in, a little bit of vanilla goes in. And then I have to keep reminding myself every time I want to take a drink of this glass of water, I have to remind myself it is melted coconut oil. Can you imagine? All right, this is vegan. I use melted coconut oil. You can use melted butter if you'd like. I wouldn't use vegetable oil or olive oil for this. I think that coconut oil is best because we're using quite a bit. It just isn't quite the same if you are using straight vegetable oil. Mix this up. I will show you the texture that we want it to be. This was the kind of thing that, like, if my mom was making, specifically when she would make blueberry muffins, I was like right there, because I knew when she was making the crumble, and I would just stick my grubby little paws in there and just eat raw crumble. She's like, these are for the muffins. And I was like, sorry, it's really good by itself. All right, then kind of break up the bigger chunks with your hand a little bit. And then I will show you the texture. This is the kind of thing, so like I obviously love baking. I love working with my hands. I'm sure you can tell that already. And this is the kind of thing that I could just really keep my hands in all day. All right, so it's kind of like a, I don't know, pretty wet sand. I can squeeze it, it turns into a solid mass, and then it really easily flakes apart. We have a question. Can you substitute brown sugar for granulated sugar? Sure, yeah, I've done that. It's fine, totally. I'm pretty, you can substitute a lot of things for a lot of things and be successful. Brown sugar for white sugar usually works great. All right. So, as promised, these are going to be apple crumble buns. Because we do not have hours and hours together, I have brought, let's see, another question. I do not use stevia. Somebody just asked about that. I don't use any alternative sweeteners. I have that question a lot about monk fruit or stevia. Somebody asked me today if I've ever used avocado instead of butter in a frosting. Nope. I stick with the more traditional fats and sugars. All right. But I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't make these recipes with that. I just personally didn't test them. I know that some people have had great success with it, but I personally have not done it. So because we don't have hours and hours together, I brought my apple preserves home from the bakery. I made them before. You'll be getting this recipe too. I'll show you what it looks like. So it's very, very thick. This is just apples, brown sugar, some spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, whatever you're into. Like I know my dad hates clove, so I wouldn't add it if I know he was eating it. You could just use cinnamon only. You could add cardamom, you could add ginger. Those are really swappable ingredients that aren't going to impact your final product. So yeah, you are going to be getting the recipe for this. My tip for you is to do it low and slow. So the advantage to that is that your apples are going to break down and they're going to have this really nice texture. So you can see that they're, let me show you. I really like an apple filling that has like, that's an actual piece of apple and some like more saucy texture. I don't like it to be just an applesauce kind of thing, and I don't like it to be just chunks. I really like to cook it low and slow, and so some of the pieces, maybe cut them smaller so that they break down a little faster, so you have some pieces left that are bigger and the other ones break down. I think it's really nice. I add a little bit of lemon juice to kind of round out the flavors. I'll always add salt. You will get these recipes. Okay, so to construct the crumble bun, we are finally here. These have really not been rising that long. You can see where the tails are tucked. I think that's so cute. These are very soft, perfectly risen, very fluffy. So essentially how this works is that you keep the outside swirl intact. You press in the middle of the swirl. So you keep the walls of the bun up, you press in the center, and put about a tablespoon of the filling in the center. Press in the middle, make sure you keep that outside wall intact, and fill it up. So you can do this with any kind of filling. You could do a berry preserve, you could do lemon curd, you could do like a cooked down like pumpkin pie filling. I've been thinking a lot about. I think that would be super delicious. Strawberry jam kind of situation. You could do store-bought. You could make it yourself. The possibilities really are endless based on what you like. I know in the book I have recipes for lemon curd, for the apple preserves, for peach preserves, berry. So it just depends on what you have and what sounds really good to you. But you do want to make sure to keep that outside of the swirl intact. That's what's going to hold it together. Okay. I will show you what this looks like. They're not overfilled, so everything's kind of level. Happy with that. And then the crumble goes on top. So we have about 10-15 minutes left as I kind of crumble these. So if you do have any questions, now would be a great time. We're going to be really mindful of the time. So just think about any questions that you might have as our time together will be coming to a close coming up here. All right, crumble left over, that is what I call money in the pastry bank. Kind of an odd saying, I guess, out of context, but it's just waiting there for you for any future projects. Pop it in the freezer if you're not going to have projects for a while so that the oil in it doesn't go rancid. Keep it on your countertop and use it if you think you're going to be making muffins or coffee cake or more buns anytime coming up. My oven is at convection 350. I'm going to pop these in. I will show you my ones that are done. All right, so here we have the finished crumble buns. If I can show you without them all falling off the pan. I will grab one. I always like to show people what I consider to be a really nice bun. So I like the looks. It looks a little bit darker because the light is so harsh right now. Let's see if I can fix that a little. So I really love the looks of this bun. So you can see that the preserves have stayed inside of the swirl. So that's why we keep the outside intact. You can see it's really thick and kind of just like dripping down the sides. The crumble's still on top, the nice golden brown. This is a little bit darker than some people might like, but I said I'm an edge person. That's what I like. Then we have the tail on the bottom. You can see that right here. And then for just showing you purposes, it comes off. That's a really delicious part. I really love it. That keeps this swirl together. So I think these look really good. I'm really happy with them. And the only thing that's left to do is to glaze them. And they baked for, I know people always want to know how long things bake. Those probably baked for 30 minutes, 35 minutes, but I always want to remind people, my oven is different than yours. Yours is different than mine. There are so many factors that go into how long something will bake. So like I was saying earlier, if your oven runs hot, maybe you should bake them at 325. If your oven runs cold, maybe, and it takes longer to bake things, maybe you should turn your oven to 375. If it looks like they're getting dark really quickly, turn the oven down. If it looks like they are taking a really long time, you can turn the oven up. So these are guidelines, but I want you to see what they should look like when they're done, so you know what you're looking for. So we're just gonna make a vanilla glaze, and this is another recipe that you can use for all the buns. You can use them for muffins, coffee cake, pound cakes, donuts, anything. It's just a great recipe to have. So this is just powdered sugar. We're gonna add a good amount of vanilla and almond milk. And I'm just gonna use a good amount of elbow grease and whisk it together. Making sure that you get any chunks out from the powdered sugar. All right. Perfect. That looks really, really nice. You will get this recipe as well. So super nice and thick. Amazing. And then the way that I train my bakers and the way that we glaze crumble buns at the store is to only glaze the outside. So that part that was a little bit darker than the rest of it. So the glaze kind of softens it a little bit. And I personally don't like to put it right on top of the filling of the preserves or whatever you're filling it with, because it's just like sugar on sugar. I like to be very specific about where I put the glaze. So if I'm doing a cinnamon roll, I do a dollop in the center, no problem. For crumble buns, I'm very specific about these things. I think it is really best if you put it around the edges. So I will get a spoon. And glaze away. All right. I think I'm gonna have some very happy neighbors tonight between this pan and the pan that's still in the oven. And a very happy husband, I think. He's keeping our dogs company in a closed off room so that we can do this together. All right, and that is the finished crumble bun. I think, oh, got a slider in the back. Do we have any final questions? I'll look at the Q&A area. So again, my name is Angela Garbacz. We were baking from my book, Perfectly Golden. I know Candace put the different ways that you can support the book festival and the libraries through in the chat. I always, like I said, like to support small businesses, small organizations. They can really use our support, and I appreciate the festival so much for allowing me to do this with you and to share my apple crumble bun recipe with you. You should be hearing from us tomorrow with a recipe. If you have any follow-up questions, be sure to follow me on Instagram. You can follow the bakery at Goldenrod Pastries. You can follow me at Angela Garbacz with an underscore at the end. I share a lot of tips and tricks and behind the scenes of the bakery. Let's see. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the festival. And like I said, any questions, find me on social media. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.